Chapter 13 The Well. When at long last that fortnight of storm blew itself out, Charlie was not feeling in companionable mood, so except when fishing or sleeping, I climbed to the lookout away up on the peak. There for me, while staring all around, out over the sea and away towards the mainland, the daylight hours passed on leaden feet. Several bêche de mer luggers were one day visible far out towards the Great Barrier Reef, their sails no larger than handkerchiefs, glinting like the sun-kissed wings of seabirds, but not a sign of the ketch. One morning I was sitting moodily by the galley fire when Charlie unexpectedly asked, "Where did you buy your rug in Cooktown?" "From Billy Jackson. That's where the bugs came from. You brought them here." In amazement I stared at the threatening face. Nonsense. Billy wouldn't sell me a blanket from his own home with bugs in it. But if he did, what odds? This was a clean island. Any man could have settled here in peace, and now you civilized beast, you've brought bugs to it. He struck me on the face. I jumped up and we got into it. Hammer and tongs, we clenched and went down, struggling madly as we rolled over the galley fire, striking and kicking and wrenching. I struck him on the temple, and his grip eased and loosened altogether to fierce thumps below the ribs. He rolled off gasping, then leapt up, and in long staggering bounds made for the tent. His face warned me that momentarily he had gone quite mad. I ran straight for the mangroves down by the well and plunged in amongst the sheltering trunks as a bullet whistled past, then another struck a dappled trunk with a vicious thud. But I was safe, running swiftly on, plunging through the mud and leaping from root to root with a surety and speed apparently impossible. Thank heaven the tide was still out. The farthest place from that madman's rifle was the granite mound. 10 minutes later I was through the mangroves and climbing up amongst the massed granite boulders. Here was abundance of cover. With ordinary caution a man would be quite safe from a lurking shot from the mangroves. Somehow I did not expect that shot. Charlie by now might be sorry the whole thing had happened. I hoped fervently he was. His weapon was only a short-range pea rifle, but it was a rifle for all that. What an idiot I'd been not to steal the bolt, when I had known for some time past how events might turn. From the summit of the mound I crouched, searching back over the mangrove tops toward the peak and the hill. But I saw no living thing. 1,000 yards distant, the peak and the hill rose abruptly above the mass of heavy green mangrove foliage, with blue sky above and green of sea around. The only time that madman could reach the mound would be when the tide was out. Then the great encircling reef and the mangrove forest would be bare of water except for pools in the creeks. And then, if he came along the great broad reef, he would be plainly visible. Not so if he came through the mangroves, which grew right to the mound. The tide was now coming swirling in over the reef and racing into the mouths of the creeks, spreading out with each oncoming wave to sweep among the mangrove roots with loud sucking gurgles. Soon it would rise up over the roots and begin to suck at the trunks themselves. Not even a madman could cross them. Besides, dorsal fins appeared suddenly, racing up the deepening creeks and disappearing into the mangroves. Here was safety. For the coming 12 hours anyway, I sat back and thought things out. 2 fools of men on a barren island, and they could not live together for a miserable few months. How tragically absurd our very lives apparently depended on our helping one another. This was no well-watered tropical island, rich with fruits and vegetables and game, Here human life must fight hard for survival. Surely to goodness we should have made an effort and another effort to be friends. For some time past it had been perfectly obvious too that even when the ketch did appear she would not be able to land a boat except under most favorable conditions. Yet here were two lunatics at one another's throats. I blamed myself a lot. Charlie was not altogether responsible. He must suffer hell when ever that gas accumulated in his stomach, but how was I to know that the man was a walking chemist's shop, and that life to him was supposed to depend on daily medical treatment? It was not my fault that he had been drunk and left his instrument and chemicals behind in Cooktown, but when all was said and done, I was the lucky man. I had youth and perfect health. I did not bear a grudge against the world, but looked on it as a wonderful playground, with this island but an episode. All life was an adventure, and I had hardly started on it. It was foolish to become downhearted now. Even here I knew how to get my own tucker. Impossible to starve. It only meant living and waiting until the catch should come. Heavens! The fish spear. It was back at the camp. Fire. Thankfully I remember I could make fire. I'd watched the natives do it often enough. Merely the patient rubbing together of two dry sticks until a wee puff of flame should light the grassy tinder. Water. That was a terrible thought. The well was on Charlie's side of the island. What if his madness lasted for some days? He might wait at the well, hidden in the mangroves. It would mean only a few days at most. I had shot dingoes that way, waited in ambush at the station tank for them to come and drink. How about venturing across to drink at night? Impossible. Even on nights when the tide was out, hardly any man could get safely through those eerie mangroves with their million entangling roots, the million overhead branches, sheltering blackness that held acres of treacherous mud, waterholes harboring giant sea eels with the teeth of devils, stranded giant cods and sharks in the inlet pools, worse still, the unknown terrors that come with the night, the possibility of a stray crocodile too. Vividly I remember when we were sailing past the turtle group, seeing a crocodile swimming far out to sea, and I had shot crocodiles away opposite on the coast at Cape Melville. No, I would suffer much before chancing those mangroves at night. Besides, Charlie could wait by the well at night just the same, even better. Relief came with the thought that Charlie's madness was only temporary. Almost certainly he would now be lying out in the lagoon on the flat rock pouring seawater into that tube, sorry in his own way that the whole thing had happened. We were two lonely men, and now in a nasty position. Completely isolated, we were existing, lucky that we could exist on a barren island. There was only one little water supply. Still, we could both keep alive while not active enemies. But if one were to attempt to hold the water against the other, there could be only one outcome: the survival of the fitter. In an uneasy medley of thoughts, I passed a miserable afternoon. The sunset was lonely. I searched for a hiding place, some deep walled-in crevice. Animals searched that way. I found a place down through a narrow cleft where, 10 feet below, the black darkness widened out into a rough chamber. The roof of this gloomy little cavern was a mess of boulders wedged one against another. Grim and cold and foreboding it looked and felt, the dying rays of the sun filtering halfway down the crevice, but it promised safety from surprise. After sunset I put in carrying dry sand in a big shell up from the reef and dropping it down the crevice. A man must have something to lie on. The stone down below was hard and already cold. I would have given my kingdom for a match. That night was devilishly lonely. A light sea breeze played all manner of queer noises among the rocks, half-heard whistlings and sighs and faint whisperings. During a momentary lull, a foraging crab slithered over a rock somewhere outside like sandpaper scraping over pebbles. Ever and again sounded a furious splashing as big fish fought in the flooded creek nearby. Robinson Crusoe was very lucky. The company of a good blackfellow here would have been welcome indeed, but the water problem meant life or death. How could I get that water? At the first sheen of dawn, I was up on top of the mound, staring towards the peak and the hill, growing plainer every moment. There was no sign of life. Yesterday and last night seemed a nightmare. With the sun came cheeriness. Almost certainly Charlie would have recovered his sanity. Everything would be all right. I grinned a bit, thinking of the stupid foolishness of yesterday, and wished the tide was out so that I could hurry straight back along the reef and walk into camp and say good day. But there came a sinking feeling at memory of Charlie's bad spells. They lasted more than one day. Out at sea, not a sail dipped in all that expanse of lazily tumbling waters. What on earth had happened to the ketch? Surely she had not gone down in that last spell of bad weather. If so, a boat would have put out from Cooktown to look for her and for us too, unless the authorities thought the ketch had picked us up and we had all gone down together. Water and something to hold the water in. What an awful lot of things a man really needed just to live. There were 3 billy cans and a kerosene tin bucket at the tent, but Charlie had possession there. There were any amount of big bucket-like shells on the reef, though they would hold water once I got it. Longingly I thought of that spear and of a fire stick. Yes, and a blanket and shaving gear, for I'd suddenly seen my whiskered face and tangled hair reflected from a pool. I did not want to become like Charlie, even in looks. The tide was just on the turn. What if I tried to get through the mangroves while the tide was still running out? He would not expect me at the well until the tide was right out. If I got there before he expected me, a sudden thought, nothing to carry water in, no spear, no fire. If I could make sure Charlie was waiting at the well, I could creep back to the reef, and shelter to the mangroves, run along the sea edge to the peak, run around it, down beside the lagoon to the tiny beach, and so to the tent. If he was not waiting at the well, it would mean he was quite all right. I'd simply walk on up to the camp, and we'd make it up and carry on as before, but more pleasantly. I laughed at the tide now rushing out. Everything was solved. All was well, and life a joke after all. It really does take a lot to kill a man. When I entered the mangroves, the water was still 2 feet above the roots, swirling its gurgling way back to sea with the violence of a mountain torrent. The real joy of solving a problem that had looked impossible temporarily banished thirst and hunger, while the active job had banished all thought of fear. It was a tough task, half wading, half swimming the first big creek, the worst. Then came the mangroves and the need to keep a foothold on the bough-like roots underwater. Almost instinctively, I now knew that those treacherous portions of a root that would collapse underfoot, but under the running water, sometimes a root would be difficult to distinguish, and down I'd slip, clawing into the maze. The outlets to the sea were the worst, only a few yards across, but wild with swirling water. It was a case of leaping in, chancing sharks, and struggling across while whirled downstream until the twisted roots opposite were close enough to grip. An apparently impossible job made possible and comparatively easy only by experience gained in fishing daily among the mangroves. I came out into open sunlight on the reef side, nearly at the foot of the peak. The well was 300 yards sharp to the left, just within the mangrove edge. a few triumphant breaths, then taking a risk, I ran along the firm coral-strewn ground until within 100 yards of the well, ducked in among the mangrove, and advanced stealthily. Surely Charlie could not expect me yet, if he really was going to wait for me at all. Then I saw the stone work of the well, and the thirst came once again, aggravated perhaps by the plunge through salt water. There was no sign of Charlie, but he could be hidden anywhere amongst the tangled maze of roots and branches and trunks surrounding the well. The silence was unearthly except for the twittering. I almost laughed. A dozen yellow-breasted birds were hopping on the stonework of the well, engaged in a lazy conversational chirrup, while prettily indulging in a fluttering bath in the shallow water. Those tiny splashes sounded liquid sweet. As I stepped forward to drink, the birds flew to the mangrove tops, squawking indignantly, and Charlie appeared. I crouched amongst the roots. He bent over the stonework and drank long and deep, remaining a few minutes to gaze reflectively into the water as the drops fell from his grizzled beard. Then, bending down, he carefully examined the mud all around the well. This deliberate searching for tracks banished all feelings of the peace I had hoped for between us. Apparently satisfied, he leisurely climbed a gnarled mangrove whose leafy branches spread directly over the well. The birds, in noisy indignation at this sacrilege to their private domain, flew in all directions.